Nothing that defines American military power today was born on the battlefield. The most important decisions were made in closed rooms, away from the public, driven by a silent fear, losing control of the world to an enemy who thought differently, fought differently, and believed that time was on their side. For decades, the United States built its military doctrine not to win traditional wars, but to prevent the Soviet Union from winning the future. And ironically, in trying to defeat Moscow, Washington ended up being shaped by it. This video is not about tanks or missiles. It's about strategic decisions that still determine how America fights, plans, and prepares for wars that may never happen, but that can never be lost. If you value in-depth analysis of how history shapes American power today, please like and subscribe to the channel. This helps the content reach more people who understand that war is not entertainment, it's a warning. Shortly after 1945, the United States believed it had solved the war. Victory over Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan seemed to prove that industrial superiority, advanced technology, and decisive air power were enough to win any conflict. But while Washington celebrated, a new adversary watched silently. The Soviet Union had not won the war in the same way. It had survived it, and that changed everything. For American strategists, the problem wasn't just military. It was psychological. The Red Army wasn't fighting to win quickly. It was fighting to resist, absorb losses, retreat when necessary, and return stronger. Stalingrad wasn't just a battle won by the Soviets. It was a demonstration that they accepted levels of sacrifice that the United States could never replicate politically. More than 20 million deaths in World War II created a strategic mindset radically different from the American one. Washington realized early on that it was facing an enemy that did not share its borders. In 1946, George Kennan sent a long telegram, warning that the Soviet Union was not seeking immediate direct confrontation, but gradual expansion, exploiting the West's political and strategic weaknesses. Shortly thereafter, the NSC 68 report formalized the central fear. The United States was not dealing with a traditional power, but with an ideological system willing to compete indefinitely. This clash forced a profound reassessment of American military doctrine. The classical logic of decisive war, inherited from the First and Second World Wars, was becoming insufficient. The Soviet Union did not need to invade the United States to defeat them. It was enough to exist, resist, and expand its influence over time. The threat was not a lost battle, but continuous attrition. From that moment on, American doctrine began to be built not around clear victories, but on preventing collapse. Every military decision began to answer a silent question: how to confront an enemy that doesn't need to win, only not to lose. This question shaped the Pentagon's strategic thinking for decades. The fear wasn't just of Soviet strength, but of moral asymmetry. While American society demanded quick results, minimal casualties, and public justifications, the Soviet system operated with total opacity. This put the United States at a structural disadvantage. Prolonged wars eroded domestic support. Inconclusive conflicts generated political division. Moscow knew this. This context explains why containment became the central axis of American strategy. It wasn't about defeating the Soviet Union in direct combat, but about limiting its capacity to advance without provoking total war. The enemy wasn't just an army. It was time. And time, it was believed, favored regimes willing to sacrifice entire generations. Recognizing this, the United States began to adapt to the adversary it feared. It restructured its forces, alliances, and priorities not based on its own traditions, but in direct response to the Soviet way of thinking about war. This was the first step in a silent transformation. America was beginning to prepare for conflicts it might never officially declare, but which it could never afford to lose. And it is precisely here that the modern military doctrine of the United States is born, not as an expression of confidence, but as a response to fear. A fear that did not come from tanks crossing borders, but from the perception that the enemy had redefined the very meaning of winning a war. The Soviet Union's greatest victory over American strategy came not from a battlefield, but from an idea the United States never wanted to accept: the notion that the best way to win a war was never to fight it. When Moscow detonated its first nuclear bomb in August 1949, something essential changed in Washington. Absolute superiority was over. From then on, war had to be conceived in terms that contradicted all American military tradition. Up to that point, the history of the United States was marked by conflicts with a beginning, middle, and end. There was mobilization, direct confrontation, and clear victory. The Soviet Union destroyed this logic by joining the nuclear club. It no longer mattered who had the best conventional army. What mattered was who could survive the first attack and still retaliate. War ceased to be an extension of politics and became a mathematical equation based on total destruction. This clash led to the birth of a doctrine that did not seek victory, but the balance of terror. Nuclear deterrence was not created out of moral conviction, but out of strategic fear. The mere fact that the Soviet Union existed as a nuclear power forced the United States to accept that some wars could not be won without destroying everything that was intended to be protected. This was a moment of profound rupture in American military thinking. Throughout the 1950s, official documents make this dilemma clear. The strategy of massive retaliation, adopted during the Eisenhower administration, was not intended to fight a nuclear war. It was intended to make it unthinkable. The logic was simple and brutal. Any Soviet attack would result in a devastating response. There was no room for gradual escalation. This transformed every military decision into a calculation of global survival. The Soviet Union, for its part, understood this logic perfectly and exploited it. By investing heavily in second strike capabilities, Moscow eliminated the possibility of a quick American victory. From the moment both sides could destroy the other even after being hit, total war became irrational. This unstable equilibrium, later called mutually assured destruction, was not a formal agreement. It was a strategic prison from which neither side could escape. For the United States, this meant something even more uncomfortable. Military success became invisible. There were no battles won to show the public. There were no territories conquered. Triumph was silent and depended on the absence of conflict. Each day without nuclear war was, paradoxically, a strategic victory. This inversion of values demanded a gigantic effort of institutional and cultural adaptation. The Pentagon needed to reinvent itself. Conventional forces became secondary to the nuclear triad. Air bases, ballistic missiles, and intercontinental ballistic missiles came to define the core of American military power. All this not because the United States wanted to fight this way, but because the Soviet Union forced this choice. American doctrine became reactive, shaped by an enemy that never needed to fire a single missile at American territory to win this conceptual battle. This new paradigm also created a profound political problem: how to justify colossal military budgets for a war that shouldn't happen, how to maintain popular support for a strategy based on constant fear and the possibility of instant annihilation. The answer was the normalization of the unthinkable. Nuclear shelters, civil defense exercises, and speeches about permanent preparedness became part of everyday life. In the end, the Soviet Union achieved something extraordinary. It forced the United States to redefine victory, power, and national security. War ceased to be a tool and became a permanent threat. And this logic did not disappear with the end of the Cold War. It remains present in every strategic calculation made to this day. The doctrine of deterrence was born not from American confidence, but from the recognition of a limit imposed by an adversary that forced the United States to accept that, in some wars, survival is the only possible way to win. The Cold War taught the United States an uncomfortable lesson. Confronting the Soviet Union directly meant risking the end of the world. But avoiding confrontation did not mean avoiding war. It would only change form, location, and appearance. This is how one of the most profound transformations in American military doctrine was born. Fighting without declaring war, winning without occupying central territories, bleeding the enemy far from its own borders. The first major test of this logic occurred on the Korean Peninsula. In 1950, when communist forces crossed the 38th parallel, Washington saw not just a regional conflict. It saw a dress rehearsal for Soviet expansion. Even without Soviet troops officially involved, the American decision was clear: not to allow further advance. The Korean War became the initial model for proxy wars. A limited conflict under strict rules, where winning meant containing, not conquering. This pattern would repeat itself over the following decades. In Vietnam, the Soviet Union and China did not need to directly confront American soldiers. It was enough to provide weapons, training, and political support. For the United States, this created a devastating dilemma. Each step toward escalation brought the nuclear risk closer. Each retreat fueled the perception of weakness. American military doctrine began to operate in an intermediate space, where there were neither clear victories nor officially admitted defeats. These wars exposed a structural clash between the American way of waging war and the logic imposed by the Soviet Union. The United States was designed for conventional conflicts, with technological superiority and defined objectives. Moscow understood that prolonged, irregular, and politically confusing conflicts eroded American willpower. It wasn't necessary to defeat the United States Army. It was enough to exhaust its patience. Vietnam left deep scars, not only military, but doctrinal. The defeat wasn't just on the battlefield. It was in the belated understanding that the war was being fought on multiple dimensions: political, psychological, social. From that moment on, American doctrine began to incorporate concepts of counterinsurgency, information warfare, and narrative control. All of this emerged as a direct response to a model of conflict that the Soviet Union helped spread throughout the world. Afghanistan in the 1980s represents a revealing strategic reversal. This time, it was the United States that applied the logic of proxy war against Moscow. By supporting the Mujahideen, Washington exploited precisely the vulnerabilities it had learned to fear. A distant, prolonged, costly, and politically corrosive conflict. The Soviet Union was not defeated in a single major battle. It was worn down to its breaking point. This experience solidified a new mindset at the Pentagon. Modern warfare didn't need to be total to be decisive. It simply needed to be persistent. Indirect interventions, support for local allies, and covert operations became central instruments of American security policy. The enemy rarely appeared with a flag or in uniform. This demanded a more flexible, more ambiguous, and often more difficult doctrine to explain to the public. At the same time, these wars created a growing internal cost. Each limited conflict accumulated political, social, and moral consequences. The absence of formal declarations of war did not eliminate the human impact. On the contrary, it made it more diffuse and permanent. American society came to live with nameless, endless wars without clear victory. This is perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Soviet Union on American military doctrine in this field. By making direct confrontation impossible, Moscow pushed the United States into a type of warfare that challenges its own strategic identity. A war fought on the fringes of the international system, where success and failure are rarely announced, but always felt. By agreeing to fight on those terms, the United States did not merely react to the Soviet Union. They learned from it, and that learning shaped how America would continue to engage in conflicts long after the end of the Cold War. The war between the United States and the Soviet Union was never fought solely with soldiers. For the most part, it took place silently, outside the headlines, invisible to the average citizen. While the world watched tanks and missiles parade, the real battle was fought behind the scenes, in underground cables, analysis rooms, and signals picked up in space. It was in this hidden realm that American military doctrine underwent one of its most profound transformations. The turning point came when Washington realized it could not match the Soviet Union in sheer numbers. Moscow had massive armies, territorial depth, and a historical willingness to absorb losses. The American response was to bet on something different. See first, know more, and decide faster. Superiority would not lie in quantity, but in control of information. Beginning in the 1950s, the United States expanded its intelligence capabilities in an unprecedented way. The creation and expansion of the CIA, and, later, the NSA, reflect this new paradigm. It was not just about collecting data, but about anticipating intentions. American doctrine came to assume that winning a war meant preventing it from starting, identifying Soviet movements before they became irreversible. The launch of the Sputnik satellite in 1957 was a strategic shock. For the public, it symbolized a space race. For the Pentagon, it was a brutal warning. The Soviet Union had demonstrated the capacity to operate in space, which meant the potential for global surveillance and the delivery of nuclear weapons via new routes. The American response was immediate and structural. Space ceased to be a field of scientific exploration and became a military domain. Reconnaissance satellites transformed the way the United States planned its defense. For the first time, it was possible to monitor bases, troop movements, and missile tests in near real time. This reduced uncertainty, but also created dependence. American doctrine became increasingly based on data, images, and electronic signals. Modern warfare was being fought by analysts as much as by soldiers. At the same time, the Soviet Union forced the United States to accept that information was also a political weapon. Influence campaigns, industrial espionage, and narrative manipulation became an integral part of the conflict. Washington responded by integrating psychological warfare and strategic communication into its military doctrine. Winning on the battlefield was not enough. It was necessary to control global perception. This period consolidated the military-industrial complex as a central element of national security. Technology, industry, and the armed forces became interdependent. Innovation ceased to be merely an advantage and became an existential necessity. Each Soviet advance demanded an American technological response, creating a permanent cycle of development and adaptation. But this quest for total control brought profound dilemmas. The more the United States invested in surveillance and anticipation, the more permanent the state of alert became. The invisible war had no armistice. American military doctrine began to operate in continuous readiness, prepared to react to threats that often only existed as a possibility. The paradox was evident. To avoid war, it was necessary to be constantly prepared to wage it. This logic, imposed by the rivalry with the Soviet Union, redefined the concept of national security. The American frontier ceased to be geographical. It became informational, technological, and psychological. This legacy remains. The infrastructure created to confront Moscow was never dismantled. It was adapted, expanded, and integrated into new domains, such as cyberspace. The Soviet Union may have disappeared, but the doctrine it helped shape continues to guide how the United States perceives threats, plans conflicts, and justifies global surveillance. The war that wasn't shown on television ended up becoming the longest of all, and it was in this strategic silence that the Soviet Union left one of its deepest marks on how America fights, defends itself, and prepares for the future. When the Soviet Union ceased to exist in December 1991, many believed an era had ended. To the American public, the Cold War seemed won. The red flag was lowered in the Kremlin. Arsenals began to be reduced, and the word peace returned to political discourse. But inside the Pentagon, the reading was much more cautious. Enemies may disappear. Doctrines, not so much. The end of the Soviet Union did not mean the end of the strategic logic it had imposed on the United States for almost half a century. On the contrary, the military structure, the global alliances, and the mentality of permanent threat remained intact. The question ceased to be against whom this doctrine would be used. Abandoning it was never considered. Nuclear deterrence, built to contain Moscow, remained central to American strategy. The nuclear triad was preserved. Submarines, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and strategic bombers remained operational. Even without an immediate equivalent adversary, the United States maintained capabilities designed for a great power war. This reveals an essential fact. The doctrine was not merely a response to the Soviet Union. It was a new way of understanding security. In the 1990s, regional conflicts and humanitarian interventions created the illusion of a unipolar world. But behind these operations, the structure inherited from the Cold War was never dismantled. Forward operating bases, global surveillance systems, and chains of command designed for confrontation with Moscow remained active. America did not return to a state of strategic normalcy. It merely redirected its focus. Russia's return as an assertive military actor, starting in the 2000s, exposed this continuity. NATO expansion, tensions in Eastern Europe, and the resurgence of deterrence rhetoric showed that the logic built during the Cold War never ceased to exist. The adversary changed form, but the playing field remained the same. At the same time, The rise of China reinforced the value of the doctrine inherited from the Soviet Union. Great power competition, technological warfare, control of narratives, and strategic deterrence became central again. Much of what guides American strategy in the Indo-Pacific today was learned in confronting Moscow. The Soviet Union not only shaped American doctrine, it created the mold that continues to be reused. This legacy has profound consequences. Structures created to avoid an existential war tend to operate on fear. They are efficient but rigid, adaptable but distrustful. The risk is that doctrines created for a bipolar world will begin to interpret any challenge as an existential threat. This influences decisions, budgets, and the very way America views the future. History shows that the Soviet Union's greatest strategic victory was not military. It was conceptual. By forcing the United States to reorganize its thinking on war, security, and power, Moscow left a mark that survived the regime's own collapse. The Cold War ended, but its logic continues to operate behind the scenes of American defense policy. Understanding this process is not just about looking to the past. It's about recognizing that decisions made decades ago continue to shape how the United States responds to crises today. Every military move, every alliance expansion, every investment in technology carries the legacy of an enemy that no longer exists, but which still influences the present. If this content helped you see American military history beyond the myths and easy victories, please like and subscribe to the channel. Here, war is not treated as a spectacle, but as a warning, because understanding the past is the only way to avoid repeating decisions that the world may not survive again.